Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hi, I'm Tricia Klass. Today I'm talking with Dr. Julie McGaha, faculty member in the School of Teaching and Learning. Julie teaches in the areas of teacher preparation, social studies education, and multicultural education. The article that we will discuss examines the impact of study abroad on male pre-service teachers. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for talking with me.
Thank you.
What does the research say about the benefits of a study abroad experience for pre-service teachers?
The benefit for study abroad exists for all students, not just teacher education students. But with regard to teacher education students, we want our students to be globally minded. We want them to be aware of diversity issues, but we also want them to be independent. And study abroad is very highly correlated with all of these things. When students return from study abroad, they often have higher GPAs. They often are more independent, and they often will experience travel on their own after they return. So all of those are good things that we want our teachers to have with them professionally and personally in the classroom to deal with diverse students, but also to prepare their students to live in this global world.
And our College Council just passed a section in its 5-year plan for preparing globally competent teachers. So this is very timely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's probably one of the biggest issues right now that we should be focused on with our pre-service teachers. We often train our teachers to work in their backyards. We assume and they assume they're going to go to their hometowns and work, and the reality is many of them aren't. So I think preparing teachers to have a global focus is essential.
Can you share with the listeners the unique advantages of selecting Brussels, Belgium as a study abroad site for student teachers?
Absolutely. So when people talk about Brussels and Belgium, they actually ask what's there besides chocolate. And in fact, my own mother, when I told her I was taking students to Belgium, she looked at me kind of funny and said, "Chocolate? What else is there?" I think that Brussels is probably the most diverse and multicultural city I've ever been to. And it could, in fact, be the most diverse city in the world. On the surface, it is a capital city, so there's all of the diplomatic and political traffic that we would assume is associated with any capital, Washington, D.C. or London. But adding to that, it's the capital of the European Union, and it's the home of NATO. So the diversity and again, that diplomatic traffic is magnified. But Belgium is an interesting case because after World War II, Belgium has experienced a wave of post-World War II immigrants. These immigrants following World War II were often Italian and from other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. They were also heavily from areas of North Africa and the Middle East. In the case of Belgium, it was primarily Moroccan and Turkish immigrants. Actually, I think there are some statistics that between 30 and 40% of the city of Brussels is foreign-born, most of which is from the Middle East or parts of North Africa. Adding to that, Belgium has a very controversial past and their colonial past. So there is about 20% of the population of Brussels from sub-Saharan Africa, and that dates back somewhat to their colonial exploits in Congo, but also to the next layer of diversity in the country, which is their very loose asylum-seeking policies. So you have people from all over the world living in this city, this tiny, tiny city with multiple layers of ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity, and they're literally bumping into one another. And it's a fascinating thing. We talk in the United States about diversity, but to see multiple layers of diversity in this small city, how it works and how it doesn't, is absolutely fascinating. So to talk about diversity and globalization, I can't think of a better place than Brussels, Belgium.
Could you also discuss your choice of research methodology to answer your research question? It's a method I don't think many listeners may be familiar with.
So we used a transcendental phenomenology. And in this approach, like phenomenology in general, we look at the lived experience of the participants. So we weren't collecting survey data. We collected almost exclusively interview data and student journals, video diaries, and things like that. So we looked at the way that our participants interpreted the experience, which is the fundamental difference in this type of phenomenology. So their truth became our research.
What were the major themes and findings of your analysis?
So with our program, we focused highly on diversity as well as just the impact of globalization on education. And what we found is that we would assume this, that students appreciated diversity, Our students talked about the fact that they liked being in places with so many different people. And at the beginning of the program, we were there for a whole semester. At the beginning of the program, the students talked about this with food, which was somewhat funny, but it served the point. Food is one of the easiest ways that we see our cultures diffuse across the world. But the students talked about liking the different restaurants, liking the different types of food they can get, but they very quickly translated that to the different types of people. They also began to talk about diversity in different terms, which was something that I think is unique about this study. I had 5 male students, which the research on study abroad is almost exclusively focused on female students. Particularly, of course, we know our teaching population is primarily white women, so this was different in that sense. But I also had 2 African American students, and the research on male students is limited in study abroad, but the research with minority students is even more limited. So these students talked about the fact that their definitions of diversity changed, and even the 2 African American students talked about they knew what it was like to be African American in the United States, but they didn't know what it was like to be Black in another part of the world. So they changed their definition. They talked about the fact that they looked at diversity in the United States as a white-Black issue, somewhat dealing with linguistic issues, but that's a relatively new thing that the majority of American teachers are dealing with. So they talked about this was a completely different diversity. They also talked about the fact that for the first time, they felt like they were the other. And in one of the video diaries, one of the students talked about how a mundane task like the grocery store became so stressful because he didn't know what to do. And he had to rely on hand gestures and until someone came up and told him in English what he needed. But he talked about the fact that what happens to children in our classrooms when we're teaching and they don't understand us. Forget the political ramifications. That's not our issue as teachers. But the students in our room have to learn. So for my students, seeing what that was like of not knowing how to communicate with people became very isolating. But it also helped develop their level of empathy for our linguistically diverse students. And the last thing was probably something we weren't really sure would happen, was the idea that this was not a school-based program. School-based programs in study abroad for teacher education are phenomenal. That was just not an option for us, but my students very quickly translated what they saw and what they were learning into classroom examples. So as we talked about a political issue, they immediately translated it into a practical issue that they might talk about in their class or how it might relate to them in their class. So it made a good bridge between non-school-based study abroad for teacher education, but connecting this idea that this is a global perspective that teachers are going to pick up on.
And what do you think are the major practical implications of your research for our and other teacher education programs and students in the future?
I would love if all students could study abroad. That's probably not very practical in terms of financially, and some students may not want to travel abroad. But I think that if we can have quality programs that are affordable for students, that's going to encourage more students to study abroad. But I also think that if we can help students study abroad, not just in school-based programs, it provides them more opportunities. And again, that's not to say that school-based programs are not absolutely fantastic, but perhaps students just don't want that, or because of where the program is, maybe it's just not practical to be in a school setting. I think that study abroad can add to our preparation by preparing students for the world beyond their backyard, but it can also give students multiple perspectives from which they can draw then in their own teaching with diversity with students, but also when we talk about the social and cultural context that schools exist in might be very different than the United States. We can't and shouldn't assume that our school system is the way all systems should work, but it is important that we understand what influences our system and then what influences other systems.
Thank you so much. I'm sure today's brief conversation will encourage others to read your article, and it's so timely for our college. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The full citation for today's article is McGaha and Linder, 2012, The Impact of Studying Abroad on Male Pre-Service Teachers, a Phenomenological Investigation, Multicultural Perspectives, Volume 14, Number 3, 163 to 168. Join us for future research breaks.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.